everyone. Welcome to Daily Revelations. So I'm back, and we are now diving into the end of our Worship Is series, at least the last couple videos, as we now dig into the Old Testament, some of the words that are used for the word worship. And we've already been through the New Testament. There are a lot of them. There aren't as many in the Old Testament. So today I'm going to go over two that are related to one another. And of course, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. So these words that I'm going to give you are Hebrew, and I'll try my best to pronounce them. Sagadah means to prostrate oneself in homage, to bow down, basically, or to fall down and adore. And Sagat Idhat is the Aramaic equivalent to that word, and also for paying homage and worship for God, gods, idols, men, anything. It just is the general covering. It's interesting too. It's also the word that is used in the word mosque. So it's a widely used word in the Middle East. So what do we learn from the Bible as we look at these words and their reference? Unfortunately, I don't have a comprehensive full listing like I did in the New Testament, but the verses that were given within the definitions give a really good understanding of what worship is, and more than not, what worship is not, as far as God asks us to worship him. Just kind of like I talked about yesterday as we were finishing up the New Testament words and what those verses pointed to, that it wasn't either. This is kind of a continuation, which is really cool, because we need to remember that the Old Testament wasn't written to be read separate from the New Testament. It's God's full story, and we get better wisdom when we dig into both and we understand that he is a God who doesn't change. Our culture changes, things about us change as a human race. And when we take what each of these things were written for in the context that they were written, and we realize that they are still applicable to us, but sometimes it requires us digging, understanding the culture, as well as allowing the Spirit to teach us what's in the text that we need to work out for ourselves, to apply it into our daily lives. So where are these references? So in Isaiah 44, and the two references I will use for this first word were both in Isaiah. It basically lays out what worship is really not, as it pertains to idols. Idol worship was a very big thing during that time period when Isaiah was writing. And there were two instances that he wanted to really point out. So one of them is that people go and they cut down a tree, and they use part of that tree to heat their home, to cook their food over, and then they use the rest of the tree to create a image, a god, that they set up in their house, and they bow down to it. He said, does that make any sense? Here's a god made with your own hands that you could burn to make your own food and warm your house, and yet you're asking it to do things for you? What about the God who created the tree, that allowed it to grow, who designed it in its first place? You're forgetting. And like we talked about yesterday, worshiping the creature versus the creator. And then in Isaiah 46, Isaiah also points out how people would take these lumps of gold and silver and take them to a smith and say, give me an image out of this. And yet, these were elements dug out of the ground. Again, the ground that was created, the earth that was created by someone far greater. And here we are melting down the things within the world he created to cast into an image and to bow down to. And just how ridiculous that really is when we consider that's what we're doing. Yet, now let's take it into our own lives. What are the things that we have around us that we rotate our lives around, that are physical objects, are physical things that were made out of things that God created? Our houses, our cars, there's wood, there's metal. And there's so many other things that the God who says, I am the Alpha, the Omega, and that verse is actually in Isaiah 44. God's explaining, this is who I am. You are ignoring this. And here's what you're bowing down to. So, anyways, we do it still. We don't do it with the pretext of they are our gods, but yet when we focus our majority of our time, and there's something we can touch and something we can feel, and that's why I called this is beyond our senses. We are so drawn to things that we can connect with our senses. We can touch, feel, see, smell. But God is beyond those things. He wants us to see him in the things that we can touch, see, smell, and taste, but not to worship them. We worship the God who made those things, who made us. And so we go on to these next verses, and they just continue to point out how important this is. The other word that I talked about is referenced twice in Daniel. And the book of Daniel, of course, we know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you don't, then you haven't read much of the Old Testament. Or if you watch VeggieTales, it's Rakshak and Benny. But how these men were asked, basically forced almost, to bow down to this huge golden image that was created by King Nebuchadnezzar, and they refused. And the penalty was being thrown in a furnace, which God saved them from, because they were obedient to worship him alone and not bow down to this image of gold, which we just talked about in the other verses. And then the second instance that refers to is that King Nebuchadnezzar actually bows down to Daniel when Daniel interprets his dream. And it was a thing of their culture to bow down and to pay homage, to just say, you've got something great. And how often do we do that to other people as well? And that was the thing that just really I felt was important in looking at these verses, is that we also idolize people. And those are things that we can touch, we can see, we can, experience with our senses. So how do we move beyond that? Well, I think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego give us a really good perspective on how to do that. We move past it by denying our willingness to do that. We say no. We say no when those things come up in our life that take priority to things that we can do to satisfy our senses and call worship, and worship a God that's beyond that, the one who's calling us to worship him in everything. Can we look beyond the physical object, the person, and see the God who created that and worship him alone? So, and that's really what we have to do. We can't idolize anything in this world, because when we do, it blocks our ability to worship God the way we should be. So, well, thanks for joining me on Daily Revelations, everyone. And I'll be back the next time I have something to share in this series that we're going through of Worship Is. Have an awesome day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.